In a quiet diner tucked away in a small town, two officers sat speaking far too loudly, boasting about roughing up a teenager and making a woman cry. They didn't lower their voices. They never felt the need to. A few tables away, an elderly black woman stirred her tea, then turned to them and calmly said they should be ashamed. They saw only her age, her quiet, her stillness, and mistook it for weakness. What they didn't know was that her name was Bernice Lanier, and she had survived worse than their arrogance. They didn't know her son was a federal attorney, and he had already begun making calls. Their mistake? Underestimating the wrong woman. But before we dive into what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you'll want to hear. That afternoon, the heat outside Joe's diner hung heavy over the pavement, rising in shimmering waves like the whole road was trying to vanish. The building itself was modest, unchanged by time, its faded sign barely legible under years of sun. Inside, the air was only slightly cooler. A tired ceiling fan spun overhead, battling the heat and smells of fried food and old coffee. Bernice Lanier walked in with quiet confidence, the kind you don't announce. It's just there. Her clothes were neat, pressed, chosen with care. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. People always noticed her, even when they pretended not to. She sat at her usual booth, placed her bag beside her, and rested her hands gently in her lap. She wasn't just waiting for lunch. She was waiting for something more. A waitress poured her a glass of water. No words were exchanged. Bernice nodded once in thanks and opened the menu, even though she already knew what she'd get. Across the narrow aisle, two officers lounged in a booth like they owned the place. Officer Trent Mallory and Officer Kyle Reich. Mallory, the larger one, leaned back and spoke loudly enough for the whole diner to hear, because he wanted them to. "Kid was mouthing off the second I stepped out," he said with a smirk. "Had him face down on the hood in seconds. Shut him right up." Reich laughed too quickly, trying to match the energy, eager for approval. "That's nothing," he said. "Pulled over some lady last week. Heels, skirt, the whole 9 yards. Told her to take her shoes off. She was crying before I even touched the trunk." They laughed again, not with joy but performance, noise to make themselves feel bigger. The rest of the diner stayed silent, heads down, pretending they didn't hear, pretending not to care. Bernice heard, and she cared. She didn't move at first. She didn't react. She let their words sit in the air. Then, with calm, deliberate motion, she turned, not sharply, but with purpose. She looked Officer Mallory in the eye and spoke softly, but her voice cut through the room like glass. "You should be ashamed," she said, firm but even. "That badge doesn't make you better. It means someone trusted you to do better. And from what I'm hearing, that trust was badly placed." The diner went still. He stared at her with the stunned expression of a man not used to being challenged. His smirk vanished, not into rage, but into a strange confusion, like someone who'd gone too long without consequences. Slowly, he stood up, squaring his shoulders and stepping toward her booth. Not fast, not overtly hostile, but with the slow, deliberate posture of someone who thought presence alone would be enough to silence her. Behind him, Officer Reich shifted uneasily in his seat, glancing toward the counter but making no move to intervene. "Mind your business, ma'am," Mallory muttered, his tone sharp but hollow. "I didn't move," she said plainly. "And this is my business. When cruelty becomes casual, silence makes it worse." A tension settled in the air, subtle at first, like a hairline crack in glass, but spreading fast and impossible to ignore. Mallory's jaw tightened as he searched for his next move. "Let's see some ID." "No," she replied, calm and clear. "You refusing to identify yourself?" "I'm sitting in a diner," she answered, unbothered, "drinking water, minding my business." until you decided to make it a show. That's enough, he snapped. You're trespassing. I've been coming here for years, she said, voice even. You don't get to claim authority here just because you say so. Mallory stepped closer, now looming over the booth, his voice dropping in pitch. You're making this harder than it has to be. No, Bernice replied, unshaken. I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be. The silence that followed wasn't uncertainty. It was resolution. Something in Officer Mallory's expression changed. Not confusion now, but realization. She wasn't going to back down. Not from his tone, not from threats, not even from the way he stood. He had seen defiance before, but never like this. Calm, grounded, and unmoved. And that steadiness was exactly what rattled him. Then, without warning, he reached forward and grabbed her arm. The move was sharp, meant to pull her from her seat. Her purse fell to the floor, her water glass tipped, and a thin stream rolled across the table. But Bernice didn't scream. She didn't resist with force. She simply became still, immovable, not through strength, but through quiet, unshakable will. The harder he tugged, the more obvious it became that this wouldn't play out the way he wanted. Officer Reich finally stood, glancing nervously at the other patrons, many of whom had frozen mid-bite, eyes wide, unsure whether looking away would save them or make them part of what was happening. I told you to get up, Mallory growled. And I told you, Bernice said, lifting her chin. I'm not afraid of you. That was it. His temper cracked. With a rough push, he slammed her sideways into the corner of the booth. The sound of her back hitting the wood echoed across the room. A few gasps broke the stillness. Someone stood up, then sat back down just as quickly. Reich stepped forward, fumbling with his cuffs, clearly wishing this had gone another way. From behind the counter, Joe, the owner, stepped out, drying his hands on a towel, concern written all over his face. Hey, he called out, his voice steady but firm. She hasn't done a thing wrong, and you both know that. Mallory turned to him with half a smirk. Joe, I'd stay behind that counter if I were you. She's a regular, Joe said, folding the towel in his hands, but not backing down. Every other week. Never once causes trouble. This isn't right, Trent. Mallory chuckled coldly. You want us digging through your inspection logs, Joe? Maybe take a peek in your walk-in? Wouldn't want to shut this place down over something minor, would we? Joe's jaw clenched. He looked from Bernice to the officer and slowly stepped back, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. A bitter one. Some rules, he knew, weren't for everyone. Thought so, Mallory muttered. With a sharp pull, he yanked Bernice to her feet. She didn't stagger. Her balance held, and when she extended her hands for the cuffs, there was no panic in her gesture, only composure. It didn't look like surrender. It looked like someone who'd seen this before and had already decided how it would end. The cuffs hung loose around her wrists, too wide for her slender arms, too big for the fine bones of a woman who had never been built to fit standard restraints. Reich had to thread a second pair through the first just to hold them in place. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the last click. Bernice didn't flinch. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the diner window, where the heat outside had turned the parked cars into blurs behind a shimmering veil. They led her through the diner in silence, past the same tables, the same booths, now filled with customers staring hard at their plates, pretending they hadn't seen, wishing they hadn't. No one spoke, no one stood, no one said her name. That's how it usually happens, not with outrage or noise, but with 100 silent stares turned carefully away. Outside, the sunlight was merciless, baking the cracked sidewalk beneath their feet. The door swung open and cast a long shadow behind her, one that stretched across the floor of the diner like a quiet verdict. Bernice stepped into it without hesitation, like she'd done it before, like the shame in this story didn't belong to her. They placed her in the back of the cruiser with mechanical routine, slamming the door harder than necessary. Mallory exhaled as if he'd just achieved something, though even he couldn't say what. At the station, things moved quickly and impersonally. Paperwork appeared. A chair was cleared. She was processed with the cold efficiency of a file put in the wrong drawer. Handled, but not really seen. They put her in a holding room. Gray walls, flickering lights, paint peeling in slow, lazy strips. She sat where they told her to, still, watchful, silent. Mallory sat first at the computer, typing fast, inputting his version of the events. His report told of a hostile civilian refusing lawful orders, causing a disturbance. The word aggressive appeared twice. Disturbing the peace showed up 3 times. Facts were bent. Context was stripped. The version he wrote wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. It was implication dressed as justification. Reich hovered nearby, uncertain, until Mallory leaned toward his body cam feed and began uploading a file. The clip he chose started well after their entrance into the diner. A different file, the one that included Bernice's calm words, quietly disappeared. "Don't be stupid," Mallory muttered without looking up. Reich didn't respond. He didn't object. He just nodded faintly, whether in agreement or in defeat, and turned away, hands shoved deep in his pockets like a man who had finally realized the heat he stood next to was fire. At the far end of the room, Sergeant Doyle Murchison emerged from his office, coffee in one hand, folder in the other. He moved with the tired ease of someone who'd signed more reports than he could count and read fewer than he should. He took the statement without question, skimmed the opening lines, and signed the bottom with a flick of the wrist. No questions, no second looks, just ink and a shrug. In the holding area, Bernice remained exactly as she'd been, upright, composed, hands loosely folded in her lap. She hadn't asked for water, hadn't spoken, but now her voice came soft, not sharp, not panicked. "I'd like my phone call, please." The officer watching from behind the glass looked up, hesitated, then brought her the landline. The receiver was still warm from its last use. Bernice picked it up and dialed without looking at the numbers. She knew them by heart. The number hadn't changed in years. He answered on the first ring. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was soft, but beneath it was something he instantly recognized. Controlled, steady, unmistakable. A pause. "It happened again," she said. "This time, worse." Another pause. "Yes," she replied. "I need you to come now." She hung up with care, returned her hands to her lap, and waited, not in hope, not in fear, but with the calm of someone who knew exactly what her son would do. 40 minutes later, the low rumble of an engine echoed across the precinct parking lot. A black SUV came into view, slowed, and stopped with quiet precision. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, measured in movement, sharply dressed, his suit catching the midday sun as he walked forward without hesitation. He didn't need to be introduced. Marcus Lanier, director of the DOJ's Federal Oversight Task Force on Police Misconduct, had arrived, and everything was about to change. He didn't enter like a guest. He entered like gravity, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. Without a word, Marcus Lanier crossed the precinct threshold, a small leather folder in hand. He set it down firmly on the front desk in front of a startled officer who blinked in confusion until his eyes landed on the badge staring back at him, Department of Justice. "Marcus Lanier," he said calmly, "DOJ. I'm here regarding the arrest of Bernice Lanier." The officer fumbled for words, but before he could respond, Sergeant Murchison stepped into the room. His face carried the mild irritation of someone used to being the authority in the room, and now finding that challenged. "We've got it all handled, Agent Lanier," Murchison said with a casual gesture toward the back hallway. "Just a minor disturbance. She refused to show ID, got loud, disrupted the place. Classic misunderstanding, really. You know how it goes. Marcus turned to face him fully. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply opened the folder and pulled out a printed copy of the report Mallory had typed, already flagged and forwarded to DOJ systems when Bernice made her call. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said. An elderly woman raised her voice in a public diner, allegedly resisted arrest, and refused lawful orders. And yet no customers were interviewed, no witness statements, no incident notes, and not a single mention of the body cam footage, despite both officers being equipped. Murchison shifted on his feet. The tension in his brow deepened. "I haven't seen all the footage yet," he muttered. "How convenient," Marcus replied, his voice perfectly calm. "Because I'm going to see it now. I want full body cam recordings from both officers, time-stamped, raw file structures, and I'll be speaking with Officers Mallory and Reich separately. Your evidence system is still tied to the internal network, correct?" Before Murchison could form a response, Marcus tapped his phone once. A moment later, the precinct doors opened again. 2 federal agents entered, quiet and purposeful. They didn't need to announce themselves. They carried their authority in how they moved. Agent Cecilia Park came first, shoulder bag slung, dark hair braided tight. She didn't speak. She headed straight toward the evidence room. Agent David Obasana followed, tall, composed, and observant. He nodded once to Marcus, then made his way to the clerk's desk, already scanning for inconsistencies. Marcus turned back to Murchison. "As of now," he said evenly, "no digital files will be modified, erased, or moved without my team's awareness. Agent Park is imaging your systems. Agent Obasana will begin interviews." "You're escalating this," Murchison said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "We don't have to blow this out of proportion." Marcus didn't flinch. "If it hadn't already been misproportioned, I wouldn't be here." From the back room, Park's voice carried out, measured but firm. "Agent Lanier," she called, "there's a flag deletion on Officer Mallory's body cam. Timestamp matches the arrest, and Officer Reich's file is trimmed. I'm retrieving both." Obasana, reviewing the intake logs, added, "We already have a mismatch. The booking log doesn't support the statement. Clerk says there was no resistance, claims the woman was silent the entire time." Marcus gave a single nod, not in triumph, but in confirmation. "Then let's begin." The overhead lights buzzed louder now, as if the building itself sensed the shift. What started as a routine, rubber-stamped arrest was beginning to unravel, not through shouting, but through precise pressure from people trained to expose the truth. Agent Park, seated at the evidence terminal, moved with razor-sharp focus. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, combing through file structures. Folders began to appear one by one, some generic, others with suspicious timestamps that hinted at manual edits. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her work spoke for itself. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Agent Cecilia Park simply worked. Because facts, once uncovered, didn't need defense. Truth doesn't shout. It just stands. She clicked into a recovered video file, hit play, and let it roll without adjusting the volume. There was no need. The footage was from Officer Mallory's body camera. The frame showed the familiar setting of Joe's Diner, with a timestamp just minutes before Bernice was accused of being loud and confrontational. But the video told a very different story. Bernice was seated calmly in her booth. Her voice was measured, her posture dignified. She didn't raise her voice once. The officers, on the other hand, came across as agitated. Their voices were louder, their movements sharp. Mallory's approach was swift, his posture tense. His hand grabbed her shoulder with unnecessary force. The push, the cuffs, the silence of the stunned diners, every detail contradicted the written report. Park paused the playback and angled the screen toward Marcus. "This footage wasn't lost by accident," she said flatly. "It was flagged for deletion, manually, then replaced with a falsified timestamp. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Across the precinct, Agent Obasana had converted a small conference room into a command post. The walls were now covered with notes and timeline diagrams. Officers and staff sat in front of him, answering questions not because they were forced, but because Obasana's calm, watchful demeanor had a way of making silence feel like guilt. One younger desk officer, voice tense and eyes flicking toward the hallway, admitted she'd seen no disturbance during Bernice's booking. She remembered Mallory seeming frustrated when asked about a file upload, but hadn't thought to question it until now. Obasana nodded once, noted it, and moved on. His background as a civil rights investigator had taught him that silence, applied correctly, could be more revealing than any threat. Then the station door opened again. Heat spilled in from the lot as Chief Arlen Devers stepped inside, his expression a mix of calm authority and veiled irritation. His uniform was crisp, more show than utility, and his walk carried the weight of someone used to smoothing things over. "Agent Lanier," he said, extending a hand with polite calculation. "Didn't expect the DOJ to send people down for something so local. Let's get this sorted before it becomes more than it needs to be." Marcus didn't shake his hand. He gestured to the paused footage on the screen. "Your officers submitted a sworn statement that the subject was aggressive, disruptive, and non-compliant," Marcus said. "What we've just recovered shows the opposite. That's not just a mistake. That's a federal issue now." Devers' expression tightened. His eyes flicked toward Murkison, who stood motionless by the doorway, forgotten coffee cup still in hand. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Devers said, a beat too quickly. "Misfiled video, incomplete records, things happen. Doesn't have to turn into a full inquiry. We can sort this internally." Marcus didn't blink. "You already had that chance. You signed off on a false report." Before Devers could respond, a new alert chimed from Park's terminal. She tapped once and brought up a second video, this time from an external source. The diner's security camera. Lower quality, but unmistakable. Bernice sitting calmly, Mallory's aggression, Reich's silent hesitation, Joe stepping in and being threatened back. Every second of it captured, unedited. Park didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Obasana walked in with a slip of paper. "Local tech team pulled this from the diner's back office," he said, handing it to Marcus. "No edits. Timestamp matches the body cam. Confirms everything." Across the room, Officer Kyle Reich sat alone at a terminal. He had stopped typing, just staring at the screen, at the words he'd written, and the truth he could no longer avoid. Reich had been staring at his screen for several minutes now, fingers hovering just above the keyboard, motionless. And then, right there in front of everyone, Agent Park, Marcus, the room, he began to change the report. He didn't hide it. He edited times, reworded phrases, softened the language. The word aggressive disappeared. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Marcus noticed. He said nothing, just watched. He didn't need to stop it. Park was already recording every keystroke, every adjustment, archiving it with digital precision. Guilt, Marcus had learned long ago, doesn't usually scream. It types, quietly. He walked over to Reich, who froze as Marcus neared. "Tell me," Marcus said, voice low, steady, "what changed between the first report and this one?" Reich said nothing. His jaw clenched. His hands lifted slightly from the keyboard as if they didn't know what to do anymore. Marcus didn't push. He simply stepped back and gave a single nod to Park. "Preserve everything." She already was. The room had changed. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if even the walls had started paying attention. What had begun as routine paperwork, another quiet day at the precinct, was quickly becoming something else. Something no one could walk away from untouched. Officer Reich sat there, the new version of the report half-typed, his fingers still in the air. But his mind had drifted far from the screen, A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, not from heat, but realization. The lie he had silently endorsed was now falling apart. And not just in front of him, but in front of professionals trained to catch it. He glanced across the room at Officer Mallory, who leaned against the wall, arms crossed, wearing the same hard smirk he'd had since the diner. His look said it all. Stand your ground, stay quiet, this will pass. But Reich didn't believe that anymore. Not with the body cam playing back on a loop. Not with Park logging every bite of it. Not with Marcus standing just a few feet away, calm, quiet, watching, like someone who already knew the ending. Sergeant Murchison, who had remained near the door with folded arms and a neutral expression, finally shifted. He rubbed the back of his neck, the realization beginning to settle in. His signature was on that false report. What once felt like a formality now looked like evidence. He took a step forward, lips parting to speak, but Chief Devers beat him to it. "All right," Devers said, raising both hands slightly, as if calming a room on the verge of eruption. "Let's all take a breath." His voice was firm, practiced, used to winning compliance without confrontation. "No need to let this spiral," he continued. "Clearly, a miscommunication. Could have been handled better, sure, but it's not a disaster." Marcus turned toward him slowly, just enough to be polite. No more. "You want to call this a miscommunication," he said evenly. "But what I see is a falsified report, doctored footage, and an arrest built on deception. What you call poor handling, I call misconduct." Devers exhaled through his nose, his tight smile barely masking discomfort. "I know you've got a job to do," he said. "But when outside investigators jump in without local context, things get exaggerated." From her desk, Agent Park didn't even turn. "The footage doesn't need context," she said, her voice razor sharp. "It's time-stamped, cross-verified, and untouched. It shows the entire event, accurately." Marcus nodded faintly, then stepped away from the group and returned moments later with a printout in hand, a floor plan of the diner, annotated with security camera positions and timestamps. "I'd like to speak with Joe Wilkins," Marcus said, "owner of the diner. He's the one who placed the call when this began." No one objected. 20 minutes later, Joe Wilkins arrived, still in his apron, dusted with flour, his face weary from a day that had taken too sharp a turn. He wasn't a man used to police stations, but he wasn't coming in to stay quiet either. He had watched a woman who did nothing wrong get dragged out of his diner in cuffs, and he wasn't about to forget it. In the interview room, Marcus kept his tone level, no pressure, no judgment, just clarity. "She was polite," Joe said after recounting the events. "Didn't yell, didn't curse, told them they should be ashamed, and maybe they should have been. But that's all." He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes. "She didn't make a scene. The only thing she did wrong was tell the truth. For not staying quiet, and I don't think that should count." Marcus gave a small nod. "And when you tried to speak up?" he asked. "They threatened me," Joe said. "Told me they'd shut me down over a code inspection, health violations. So I backed off." His hands folded in his lap, knuckles white. "Didn't feel right then. Feels worse now." Marcus thanked him and personally walked him to the lobby. Just before Joe stepped out, Marcus paused. "She's not the first they've done this to," he said. "But she might be the last, in that building at least." Joe nodded solemnly. "She's tougher than she looks. Always has been." As Joe exited, Marcus turned back toward the main room. Reich still sat at the terminal, now staring at nothing, his hands resting quietly. Mallory stood nearby, arms crossed so tightly they might as well have been glued to his chest. Murchison had vanished behind his office door. Devers lingered near the entryway, saying nothing. The station was quiet again. But this was no longer routine silence. It was the kind of hush that follows a shift, like the still air before a storm. What used to be a space of casual chatter, boots on tile, and shuffling paperwork now felt like it had been wrapped in something heavier: accountability. Marcus stepped to the center of the room and let his eyes settle on each corner: the officers, the hallway to evidence, the closed door hiding Murkison. When he spoke, his voice didn't rise, but it carried. It made conversation stop. "Effective immediately," he said, "this facility is under federal lockdown. No reaction at first. All personnel are restricted to the premises until evidence protocols are complete. No files are to be accessed, removed, or altered without DOJ clearance. All department-issued and personal phones are to be placed on the table outside this room. You'll retrieve them once authorized." The room didn't erupt. It froze. An officer in the back finally moved, unclipping his phone and walking slowly to the table. Then another, then another. One by one, devices were laid down, like artifacts of a version of the day that no longer existed. Marcus didn't need to force compliance. He had seen this pattern before. Who would move first? Who would wait? Who would resist? None of it surprised him. What mattered was that the narrative was now locked. No more edits. No more deletions. In the holding room, Bernice sat exactly as before, hands folded, posture straight, her dignity intact. The walls around her were bland, lifeless, built to erase thought. But her mind wasn't there. It was back, in memories that had never dulled. She was 13 the first time she was told to move to the back of the bus. It was summer. Georgia heat wrapped around her like a second skin. She remembered the driver's look, impatient, dismissive, as if she was the disruption, not the sign above the seat. Later came the classrooms, segregated, underfunded, full of old books with erased names. She remembered the bitter taste in her mouth the day she asked why her school had no library and was sent home for asking. She had marched in Birmingham, locked arms in Montgomery, spoken in church basements and civic halls. She'd been called loud, difficult, ungrateful, dangerous, not because she shouted, but because she refused to let silence be mistaken for obedience. Now, at 83, in a holding cell that tried to strip away identity, she didn't feel shame. She didn't feel fear. She felt something else. Stillness, strength, the kind that came from surviving more than this and still being here. Outside the station, life carried on, but not untouched. The story had already begun to move. Joe Wilkins wasn't one for speeches, but he couldn't shake what he'd seen. So after leaving the precinct, he wiped the sweat from his brow, swapped aprons, and found himself face to face with two young local reporters, barely out of college, but sharp enough to recognize when something had cracked. He didn't go on record. Not yet. But he told them what happened, how Bernice had spoken, how the officers reacted, how silence filled the room, how his own voice had been threatened away. He asked that his name be left out, but he gave them the truth, and truth, once whispered, rarely stays quiet. By the time the sun began to dip behind the courthouse dome, a first draft of the article had already reached inboxes beyond the county line. The headline was measured, but unmistakable. Local arrest sparks DOJ action. Diner owner speaks on incident. And below that, a single photo of Joe's diner, its front door still ajar, like a question left unanswered. The door to the holding room creaked open, not urgently, not aggressively. There was no officer, no command, just a single tall figure who stepped inside with the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. Marcus Lanier entered and gently closed the door behind him, not like a warden, but like someone shielding the room from the noise outside. He didn't speak right away. Neither did Bernice. He walked to the opposite side of the table and sat, pulling out the chair with quiet precision. The space between them wasn't much, but it felt meaningful, not because of physical distance, but because of everything they had lived through, separately and together. Bernice studied him for a moment, longer than he expected. She saw the lines beneath his eyes, the weight he carried in his posture, the restraint wrapped tightly around his shoulders like armor. "You shaved," she said gently, with a flicker of dry humor in her voice. "Makes you look even more serious." A brief smile flickered across Marcus's face. Nothing showy, nothing to be remembered, just real. She nodded once and sat up straighter. "They didn't hurt me," she said, cutting off the question before it formed. "Not really. Not like they could have. Not like I've seen." Marcus's eyes dropped to her wrists. The faint imprint of the cuffs was still there, a red outline against her skin. He didn't reach out, didn't offer comfort. He knew her too well, knew that sympathy, even from him, could feel too close to pity, and Bernice had no use for pity. "I saw the footage," he said. "Diner security, body cams. You were calm, clear. They won't be able to spin it any other way." Bernice's gaze stayed level. "I wasn't brave. I was tired. There's a difference." Marcus leaned back, elbows resting against the arms of the chair. "You were brave," he said. "Tired can wait." They let the silence hang a little longer. It wasn't awkward. It was familiar. A silence filled with the kind of history you don't have to explain. They hadn't sat together like this in years, just the two of them. No meetings, no plans, no pretending. "I've lived long enough to know when it's time to speak," Bernice said quietly. "You taught me that." Marcus looked up at her. "You taught me first." Her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something softer. Something that belonged only to him. He remembered that look from Sunday mornings, years ago, when she'd fix his crooked tie with the same steady hands that had lifted generations. "You always wanted to fix things," she said. "Even when you were little, always questioning your teachers, always asking why things were the way they were. I didn't think you were listening to me back then, but I was wrong." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing right away. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of everything he'd held back. "I was always listening," he said. "That's why I knew today wasn't just a misunderstanding." He opened the folder on the table and pulled out a stack of documents, highlights, redactions, timelines. "Cecilia found more," he said, sliding the papers toward her, not expecting her to read them. "Arrest logs, going back almost 2 years, dozens of cases, all filed under resisting, trespassing, disturbing the peace, every name Black or Latino, timestamps altered, reports edited after they were signed, citations issued without bookings." He paused. "Mallory's name is on most of them." Bernice didn't blink. "And no one stopped him," she said quietly. "No one even looked." Marcus nodded once. "Until now." "Or if they did," Marcus said, "they didn't care." Just outside the holding room, Agent Cecilia Park continued moving with surgical precision. No wasted motion, no small talk. She navigated between terminals and storage drives, logging inconsistencies, timestamps, and altered records like a forensic clockmaker. What she'd built was no longer just evidence. It was a timeline, a pattern, a portrait of how Officer Mallory's authority had evolved, from enforcement to impunity. There were arrests that led to no charges, citations that vanished after missed court dates, footage conveniently labeled as technical failure during key incidents. She didn't speak unless necessary, but when she did, her words landed like conclusions. "The system isn't broken," she told Obasana earlier that day, flipping through a folder of report logs. "It's working exactly as it was built to. Mallory didn't break protocol. He became it." Inside the holding room, Bernice placed her palm flat on the table. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus exhaled, slow and steady, the breath of someone who isn't fully sure but knows he must lead anyway. "I'm taking this to the U.S. attorney," he said, "and if the evidence holds, and it will, there'll be an indictment. Park's data alone justifies a federal monitor. If Obasana finishes cross-referencing the logs with internal memos, we'll have grounds for a full department investigation. She looked up. Mallory? First, Marcus nodded. Reich's already breaking. Murchison signed reports he never read. Devers will try to cover himself, but he's tangled in the same web. They're not fighting the truth anymore, just buying time. Bernice leaned forward slightly, voice lower. You think this town is ready for what's coming? Marcus met her gaze without hesitation. No, but readiness has never been the reason to speak up. Another pause settled between them, this one deeper, heavier, familiar. I used to think dignity meant staying quiet, Bernice said, holding your peace, keeping calm. But that's not it, is it? She looked at him, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. It's not stillness, it's standing. Marcus nodded. And sometimes, standing means drawing fire. Bernice glanced toward the door, then back to her son. Then it's good we come from fire. He didn't answer with words. He just reached out, quietly placing his hand over hers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for show. It was a shared promise, unspoken, unshakable. Outside the building seemed to hold its breath, but inside that small room, something had shifted, something unstoppable. The sun was sinking over the rooftops now, turning the steps outside the station into golden slabs. But the heat in the air wasn't just summer anymore. It was unrest. People had begun to gather, first a few, then more. The whisper had become a murmur, and the murmur was finding its voice. Inside the precinct, Chief Arland Devers stood alone in his office. Blinds drawn, air conditioning humming, none of it easing the tension climbing up his spine. He held the phone to his shoulder, flipping nervously through a notepad of old state-level contacts, names that once felt like back doors. Now they felt like lifelines. His voice was lower than usual, measured. It's not what it looks like, he said into the phone. The DOJ's blowing this out of proportion. Some clerical issues, maybe a bad judgment call. This isn't a criminal conspiracy. He paused, listening. His free hand traced the edge of the desk. No, I didn't know she was his mother. Another pause. Yes, I've seen the footage. It's not that bad. This'll settle down if we let it breathe for a few days. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. The pressure was rising. The timeline was collapsing. And those names in the logs, some of them had families that wouldn't stay quiet. He ended the call without a clear response and peered through the gap in the blinds. Outside, people were holding signs, homemade, angry, focused. Downstairs in the lobby, Marcus stood calmly amid the hum of movement. Park and Obasana were in motion, checking files, logging statements, archiving everything from drawers to desktops. The entire structure of the department was being preserved and mapped. Devers came down the stairs a moment later, his composure strained, his voice trying too hard to sound casual. I just got off the phone with the state attorney's liaison, he said. They're concerned this is becoming unnecessarily escalated. You've made your point. Files are being reviewed, protocols reevaluated. This doesn't have to get bigger. Marcus turned, unmoved. Bigger? He echoed. Devers gestured toward the windows, where shadows shifted just beyond the glass. You've got people gathering outside. The press is circling, Devers said tightly. This town can't take that kind of spectacle. This thing's spiraling. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It's not spiraling, he said, calm and sharp as glass. It's surfacing. What you're feeling now isn't chaos. It's consequence, and you don't get to choose how consequences arrive. Devers opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Across the room, Sergeant Murchison stood just outside his office, pretending to monitor the activity. He tried to look useful, but the lines in his face betrayed him. He watched the DOJ agents pull up log after log, his name stamped on many of them, arrests with no charges, complaints never logged, citizens who vanished into paperwork with no resolution, each signature time-stamped, each timestamp linked directly to him. He stepped into the hallway, just in time to see Agent Obasana escort a records clerk into an interview room. A bead of sweat slid under his collar. 27 years on the force. He knew which forms to skip, which reports to skim, and which officers to shield. Mallory had always been rough, but he got results. He kept problems quiet. He made numbers look clean, and now it was all unraveling. Outside, the crowd had doubled. It wasn't a mob, not yet, but it had formed, solid and undeniable. Faces lined the sidewalk, expressions split between anger and disbelief. Phones were raised. A news van had pulled up across the street. A reporter stood in front of the lens, her words lost to the buzz of building unrest. Handmade signs rose into view. One read, "Justice for Bernice." Another, simpler, "We saw the footage." At the center of it stood Joe Wilkins, arms crossed. He hadn't planned to speak, but when someone asked what he saw, he didn't lie. He described the calm in Bernice's voice, the way Mallory escalated without cause, the cuffs, the threats, the silence afterward. He told them how they tried to silence him, and how he wasn't staying quiet this time. And the story, once confined to a booth in a diner, had begun to ripple far beyond town lines. It spread through local blogs, text threads, family calls. Old encounters returned to light. Parents remembered finds that never made sense. Teenagers who'd once stopped talking were now listening and watching. Back inside, Marcus stood with arms folded as Agent Park returned from the hallway with a printed sheet in hand. Red lines and notations snaked down the margins. "There's a second set of data," she said, "hidden under an alias account on the evidence server. Goes back even further. Logs predating body cams, off-the-grid footage, some of it manually archived before protocol ever existed." Marcus scanned the paper, his expression unchanged. "Keep pulling," he said. "This doesn't stop at one man." Park nodded and disappeared back into the hallway. Marcus looked around the station. Officers avoiding eye contact, DOJ files now stacked and boxed. The slow, steady hum of printers and murmurs of agents filled the room, like the ticking of a clock, counting down the life of a story that had been buried too long. This wasn't just about Bernice anymore. This was about what her silence had echoed. The names never written down, the cases never filed, the years of abuse wrapped in polite paperwork, and now, finally, the town was listening. Outside, the crowd had grown again. No chance yet, but the energy was rising, palpable, like a drumbeat forming in the chest of every onlooker. Inside, the air shifted again as Agent Obasana re-entered the lobby. His stride was fast, focused. In his hand, a thin envelope. It had been sealed, filed, nearly forgotten. Hidden so well, it might never have been found, if not for Obasana's trained eye catching a name on the routing slip. He handed it to Marcus without a word, but the urgency was there. It bore a DOJ field stamp, no return address. Inside, a typed letter. No signature, no name, but what it said was clear. False citations, retaliatory arrests, racial targeting, suppressed evidence, insider knowledge, methodical, specific, impossible to ignore. Someone on the inside had written this, and at the top, highlighted like a flare, the date, 6 days ago. Marcus read it twice. It wasn't angry. It was careful. Someone trying to stay invisible while begging to be heard. He looked up. Who found this? Obasana gestured back toward the filing room. It was rooted for internal affairs review, he said. Sat there unopened. But whoever wrote it, they're close. Real close. The language, the code structures. It's someone inside. Marcus nodded once, the paper still in hand. The story had begun with one woman's voice, but now the walls themselves were starting to speak. This wasn't written by someone on the outside, Marcus muttered, narrowing his eyes. Obasana nodded. The language, procedure codes, citation structures, whoever wrote it had inside access. He held up another sheet, now flagged with DOJ metadata. We traced the transmission log. The sender tried to mask their digital ID, but not perfectly. It came from this precinct. Same terminal used to log Officer Reich's shift notes. Same time block. He was working late. No other officers were logged in. Marcus looked down at the paper, the letter that had triggered everything. The quiet warning, the call for help. It hadn't come from outside. It came from Reich. He turned sharply, scanning the lobby until his eyes landed on the younger officer, seated again at the same terminal, shirt loosened, vest removed, but his hands tapping, twitching, like nerves in free fall. Marcus approached slowly, not with caution, but with gravity. He stopped in front of the desk and spoke without volume, just truth. "You sent it." Reich looked up. The words hit him like a wave. His face paled. He blinked once, twice, before anything came out. "I didn't know it was her," he whispered, voice raw. "I swear I didn't know." Marcus didn't respond. "I had a call scheduled," Reich continued, his voice cracking. "Off the record, internal affairs. I couldn't sleep anymore. Not after what I'd seen. The stops, the stuff that never made it into reports. Mallory would laugh like it was routine, and I just let it go." He rubbed his face like he could erase it. "I never thought they'd do it to someone like her. I thought it'd be someone loud, someone they could spin into a threat. Not her. She was just sitting there." He paused, breath ragged. "And when he shoved her, I didn't say anything. I just stood there." Marcus leaned in slightly, voice dropping lower than a whisper, sharp as a blade. "You stood there while he threw an 83-year-old woman into a booth hard enough to shake the windows. You stood there while he threatened a man who tried to defend her. Then you filed a report you knew was false." Reich didn't lift his head, shoulders tight, hands clenched. "I didn't want credit," he said. "I just wanted it to stop." Marcus leaned even closer, voice now ice cold. "You don't get peace after staying silent. You don't get clean for whispering truth when it was safe." Reich trembled. "Then finally, then charge me," he said. "I'll sign whatever you put in front of me." Marcus stared at him, calm, still. "You'll testify," he said, "under oath, every name, every time, every log. If you flinch, if you hold back anything, I'll bury you in the system you helped protect." "I will," Reich nodded, jerky, but real. Marcus turned to leave, then paused. "She's not the first you stood by and watched, but she might be the last." And he walked away, without looking back. For the first time that day, Reich wept. By the end of the third day, the Department of Justice filed formal notice with the federal court. The case now had everything it needed for full oversight. The footage had exposed what happened, but Reich's reluctant voice, the insider's truth, made it undeniable. And that was what Marcus needed. The civil suit came next, not for vengeance, for precision. Filed on behalf of Bernice Lanier, it named not just the officers, but the leadership structure that enabled them. Chief Devers, Sergeant Murchison, city administrators who had approved misconduct with a pen and a shrug. The charge wasn't just wrongful arrest, it was systemic neglect, racial targeting, willful abuse under the color of law. In discovery, Marcus submitted an audit compiled by Agent Park. Over 200 pages, each page tracking a failure, not a pattern. A policy, 2 years of rigged arrest records, clerical logs, patrol schedules, metadata, all cross-referenced. Reports had been backdated, footage deleted, force incidents erased by omission, and at the center, Officer Trent Mallory. His name appeared in over half the flagged files: falsified detentions, unlawful searches, redacted tags. The picture was unmistakable. He hadn't worn the badge as a responsibility. He wore it like a license. And when the indictment landed, the badge didn't shield him anymore. He didn't respond with remorse. He responded with contempt. Mallory's arraignment was held behind closed doors, sealed under court order due to public backlash and threats against the courthouse. His attorney, a veteran defender of law enforcement under scrutiny, began with the expected strategy: spin the tip into betrayal, paint Reich as a self-serving liar, and claim the video lacked proper context. They argued Mallory was simply doing his job under pressure in a volatile community. But what they didn't anticipate, what they couldn't prepare for, was that the same system they'd once used to hide now worked against them. This time, it worked for Marcus, and Marcus had brought the receipts. Under terms of his plea agreement, Reich took the stand, and he didn't hold back. He described the department not as a place plagued by a few bad actors, but as an entire system rotted from its roots. He admitted his silence, his complicity, his guilt. But more than that, he outlined how Mallory coached officers to omit details, clean up language, and sanitize reports before submission. He recalled locker room boasts about teaching respect to black teens, how Mallory laughed about grown men crying when he tightened the screws. The courtroom, though closed to the public, carried the heat of consequence in every word. By day 5, Reich's deal was finalized. Reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, administrative leave, no pay, final sentencing pending. And behind him, the walls of the department began to crack. Sergeant Doyle Murchison was next. Once seen as a stable fixture in the department, Murchison found himself summoned to testify. He had signed the original report on Bernice's arrest. He had greenlit Mallory's conduct logs without review. Worst of all, he had dismissed multiple citizen complaints without triggering follow-up. Presented with footage and time-stamped logs, his voice broke. He claimed ignorance. It was fast-tracked, he said. Just administrative. But the video said otherwise. So did the metadata. So did the signatures on reviews he never questioned. By the time he stepped down, he no longer looked like a man guarding a system. He looked like a man being crushed by one. Inside the precinct, structure collapsed. Not the building, but its foundation. Morale evaporated. Officers once loyal to Mallory began avoiding interviews. Some requested transfers. Others called in sick. And one by one, anonymous files started appearing on Agent Park's desk. No labels, no names, just evidence, quietly surfacing. Outside, protests had evolved. The anger was still there, but now it looked like purpose. People carried signs not just for Bernice, but for others, names long ignored. Quiet stories that had once seemed irrelevant now held weight. Every poster, every chant. Every news crew outside that building became part of the pressure squeezing inward. In the DOJ's temporary field office, a converted conference room, Marcus stood in front of a whiteboard now covered with dates, charges, and outcomes. Park briefed him. Federal monitor approved. External oversight in place. The precinct's now under compliance review. Devers has been placed on administrative hold pending ethics investigation. Marcus gave a small nod. His face was calm, but the lines were deeper now, not from fatigue, from resolve. They weren't just winning a case, they were reclaiming something. And it had started not with headlines, not with agents, not with outrage, but with a woman in a diner who refused to be quiet. By the 7th day, the precinct no longer felt like itself. No casual chatter, no coffee breaks, no quiet signatures. Every hallway echoed with the steps of federal agents. The walls, once decorated with commendations, were now covered in laminated evidence charts, audit notices, and legal instructions. A new energy had taken hold, and it left no room for denial. Chief Arlen Devers stood in what used to be his office, blinds still drawn, light avoided like a threat. He paced behind his desk, his steps twitching with an urgency that had once served him well. Budget crises, press flare-ups, even internal scandals. He had weathered them all. But not this. This wasn't a narrative that could be revised. This was federal. It was visible. It was personal. When the knock came, he wasn't surprised. Marcus entered without waiting. He closed the door behind him and stood still, just inside, not crossing the threshold, not out of politeness, but because the air inside Devers' office still carried the stench of expired authority. Neither man spoke at first. Finally, Devers gestured toward the chair across from his desk. A faint smirk twitched on his lips. "You gonna tell me I'm finished, Agent Lanier? Or you want a judge to do it?" Marcus didn't sit. He didn't smirk back. "I don't care how it ends for you," he said evenly. "I care how it ends for this department." Devers dropped into his chair. It creaked beneath him. He looked smaller than he had days ago, not from age, but from the collapse of an illusion. That power would protect him. His voice, when it finally came again, was quiet, more uncertain than it had ever been. Devers' voice was low, bitter. "You think you fixed something?" he asked. "You think tearing this place apart is justice?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I think justice is being seen," he said. "And your department made sure people like my mother stayed invisible until the cuffs came out." Devers shook his head. "You don't understand how towns like this work. You think oversight cures fear? You think policy changes people?" "These officers followed your lead," Marcus cut in. "They learned how to cut corners from how you ran this building. They ignored the truth because you did. You called it maintaining order. I call it cultivating rot." Devers stood, not in protest, but because weariness had finally taken hold. "This isn't about me," he muttered. "It never was. It always was," Marcus replied, his voice razor-sharp, "because leadership is complicity when it chooses silence, and you chose it every single time. Every complaint, every skipped protocol, every name ignored." Devers looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. The strength was gone. He sank back into his chair. Marcus turned and walked out, no satisfaction in his step, only purpose. Later that day, the county courthouse convened its public hearing. A long table stretched under sterile lights. Microphones hummed. DOJ representatives on one side, local counsel on the other, and between them, nothing but air and the truth. The room was packed. Locals filled every seat. Dozens stood along the walls, arms crossed, eyes forward. The silence was weighty, not out of fear, but focus. They weren't waiting to yell, they were waiting to matter. Bernice Lanier entered quietly. She declined the front row seat offered by a staff escort and chose instead to stand along the back wall. Hands clasped, no podium, no microphone. Her story had already been told, in footage, in papers, in 1,000 conversations. Today she listened. One by one, citizens rose. A father whose son had been cited twice for non-compliance, never charged. A shop owner stopped outside her own store because she matched a description. A teenager who said nothing, just placed a photo of his brother on the table and walked away. Then Marcus stepped forward, straight-backed, still, focused. "This isn't about one arrest," he said. "It's about a system that rewarded silence and punished honesty. About officers who didn't just break the rules, they rewrote them. And about the lives quietly damaged while signatures turned into rubber stamps." He paused, letting it sink in. "My mother didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She told the truth. And for that, they tried to make her small. They erased her dignity. But they didn't count on who she raised. And they didn't count on all of you. As he stepped back, no one clapped. The silence was sacred. By evening, federal monitors were en route. A new task force was authorized to oversee not just operations, but training, discipline, complaint handling, every layer of the precinct's function. Chief Devers was suspended. Sergeant Murkison, already under deposition, now faced formal referral for negligence. Mallory's case moved to pre-trial. Reich remained on release, cooperating under oath. But the real change wasn't legal, it was personal. The town no longer looked at the precinct as just a place to enforce the rules. It was now something else, something that could be shaped, watched, challenged. What had once been a wall now resembled a window, and people were finally seeing inside. The courthouse stayed hushed, not because of protocol, but because so much had already been said. The trial had stripped away excuses. What remained were facts, raw, undeniable. Now it was time for closing arguments. Marcus rose. Wearing the same dark suit he'd worn the day he walked into that precinct lobby, he stepped into the center of the courtroom. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, let every eye find him. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. His voice carried weight, measured, firm, unyielding. "We are not here because one woman was disrespected," Marcus began, slowly, deliberately. "We are here because that disrespect was considered normal, expected, ingrained." He let the words breathe, let them settle. "We are here because when Bernice Lenier, an 83-year-old woman who marched beside legends, who survived segregation, who taught in schools that tried to forget her name, spoke with quiet dignity in a diner, she was punished for it." Marcus stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. And it wasn't just about that moment. It was about what that moment represented. Her voice wasn't loud. Her tone wasn't violent. Her actions weren't unlawful. But they cuffed her anyway, because to them, her refusal to be silent was defiance. And they built a system around the idea that defiance must be broken. He turned toward the jury, locking eyes, not as a prosecutor, but as a man asking them to see the truth. They called it standard procedure. They called it a miscommunication. But we have the video. We have the reports. 2 years of altered records, and the same pattern again and again. Black citizens disproportionately stopped, cited, silenced. His voice grew firmer. How many voices were lost because they didn't have a son working in federal oversight? How many complaints disappeared because someone didn't know who to trust? Marcus let that silence linger. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about recognition. And this court has the chance not just to award damages, but to name what happened. What was done to Bernice Lenier wasn't an error. It was an offense, not just against her, but against every person who ever passed that precinct in fear, wondering if they'd be next. He glanced toward Bernice, seated quietly in the front row, her posture as composed as it had been in that diner booth. He didn't need to speak to her. She had already said everything that needed saying. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," he said. "I'm asking for your respect. Show it by making sure this doesn't get buried like the stories before it." He nodded once, returned to his table, and sat. The courtroom was silent. No rustling, no murmurs, just stillness. When the verdict came hours later, the foreperson's voice did not shake. "We find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded, $2.4 million. It wasn't just money. It was a message. There were gasps. A few people wept, not in triumph, but in release. Bernice closed her eyes, then opened them again. Not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Not of victory, but of truth. In the following weeks, the consequences came swiftly. Trent Mallory, once untouchable behind his badge, stood trial in a federal courtroom. With Reich's testimony, park's digital records and hours of documented abuse, the verdict was decisive. Guilty, falsifying reports, violating civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, sentence, 15 years, no parole. His lawyer blamed Reich, blamed training, but the judge's response was clear. This is not a failure of training. This is the absence of integrity. Sergeant Murchison, forced to testify again, could no longer deny the evidence. He admitted to negligence, to signing off without review, to a culture built on deliberate blindness. His badge was surrendered, his pension suspended. Chief Devers resigned in disgrace before formal hearings began, and the precinct shuttered, officially, permanently. The radios were off, the locks changed, the emblem taken down. In its place, a new unit, federally supervised. Community oversight written into its charter. Leadership rebuilt from the ground up. The very people who once feared walking through that door now had a say in how those inside would serve. And at the center of it all, Bernice Lanier, unchanged. She refused interviews, declined book deals, asked not to be turned into a headline. She returned to her life, morning walks, quiet evenings, her Sunday hat still pressed. She had never asked for attention, only for decency. She didn't claim victory, but she knew those who tried to silence her had lost something far more permanent, their ability to do it again. Justice didn't come quickly, but it came, and for Bernice that was enough.